in record time.
These rafts were about 200 feet long and 50 feet wide. Now that means that you can't just use one single tree trunk. You have to also put multiple trees together and then lash those together too. This requires more than a Boy Scout knowledge of knots.
With speed and efficiency, Hannibal's soldiers harvested massive conifers from the surrounding forests and connected the trees together with rope. One thing his engineers had to account for was the psyche of the elephants. So once the logs were bound together, the barges were piled high with a layer of sticks and a layer of earth so that the elephants would think they were on solid ground. When all was ready, Hannibal gave the signal to release the barges. The Gauls, startled by his boldness, were mystified when they saw the Carthaginian general leading his troops, cavalry, and elephants en masse across the turbulent Rhone. When he arrived at the river's opposite bank, the Gauls broke in panic and fled without striking a blow. The entire operation took a little more than 9 days.
I think the crossing of the Rhone in such a short space of time, using rudimentary equipment, is one of the great achievements of military history. And people slightly forget the small engineering miracles that made all this possible.
Hannibal and his army continued on and made their way to the foot of the Alps. With winter looming, the troops were starving and exhausted. As they ascended, they confronted another seemingly impossible obstacle: giant boulders. Hannibal's engineers devised a plan that would allow the troops not just to go over, but through.
The stratagem of crossing the Alps certainly shocked the people of Italy. No one expected an army with elephants to make it across. And although the Alps may have seemed in places impassable, this idea of breaking up the mountains themselves to create a pathway to get your pachyderms across was a brilliant idea.
Now, how did Hannibal get his men, not to mention all those elephants, up, over, around, or through these giant boulders? Well, according to the Roman historian Livy, he came up with an ingenious plan along with his engineers that would literally move mountains. They cut big crevices through these boulders, and then they got wood from the surrounding forests. They'd wrap these boulders in the wood, and when the wind was right, they'd torch the wood. The rocks would heat up, and just when they were hot enough, they'd pour boiling vinegar into the crevices, which would shatter or melt the rocks such that his men could break them apart with iron implements. Now, what was Hannibal doing up in the Alps with all this vinegar? Well, if this is true, and we like to think it was, otherwise how did he get across the Alps? It speaks volumes to the genius of this brilliant general. I'll tell you one thing, after navigating the snow of the Alps, the sight of the plains of northern Italy must have been very, very welcome.
On August 2nd, 216 BC, near Cannae in southern Italy, Hannibal faced off against Roman forces under the command of Terentius Varro in a decisive conflict that would seal the fate of these two empires. As dawn breaks, Hannibal draws up a force of 50,000 men, newly strengthened with the help of hired mercenaries, against Varro's nearly 90,000 Romans. Varro decided to try and crush his opponent, sending a massive force to attack Hannibal's center. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. Anticipating Varro's strategy, Hannibal orders his cavalry to circumvent the Roman ranks from the rear.
Hannibal had certainly done his homework in studying the psychology of his opponents, and he was able to trick them into his center, and then his forces could engulf them.
Completely surrounded, the Romans were slaughtered where they stood. Only 3,500 Romans managed to escape. 10,000 were taken prisoner, and 70,000 were left dead on the battlefield.
At the Battle of Cannae, the single greatest defeat ever inflicted on a Roman army throughout its entire history. And of course, we have to go to World War one to find a scale of slaughter as big.
Cannae was a masterpiece of military strategy, but Hannibal was unable to capitalize on his string of victories. He fought on for another 13 years, mounting siege after siege on Rome and its surrounding cities. But ultimate victory remained elusive. He could defeat them in the field, but he lacked the proper weapons to take on the Roman capital. In 204 BC, Rome went on the offensive and launched an attack on Carthage. Hannibal finally returned home to muster its defense.
In 204 BC, Scipio Africanus, who had already beaten the Carthaginians in Spain, convinced Rome to let him go around Hannibal altogether and attack Carthage directly. Hannibal was recalled to his city to defend it. Now, these two heavyweights met and spoke. We have no idea what they said to one another. It's lost to history. In 202 BC, they met again at the Battle of Zama. And Hannibal was defeated, and he was forced to surrender to an enemy that he'd spent his entire life trying to destroy. He would not fulfill his father's wishes. He was exiled from Carthage, and years later, near present-day Turkey, he committed suicide.
Carthage's defeat at the end of the Second Punic War forces the empire to submit yet again to Roman terms.
They are forced to surrender in 202 BC. The Romans again impose very harsh peace terms on the Carthaginians, meaning, first of all, they must again pay an indemnity, a tax to the Romans. Also, the Carthaginians lose their overseas territories, meaning their territory is now confined to areas just around Carthage itself. One last very important part of this treaty was that Carthage could not fight a war, any war, even a defensive war, without Rome's okay.
With Carthage stripped of its military might, the field was now open for the Roman army to begin its unstoppable conquest of the ancient world. And their first major target would be the wounded city of Carthage. All that stood in the way was the ancient world's strongest fortifications. Hannibal ad portas, which translates to Hannibal is at the gates, was often used after the Second Punic War to scare children to bed. 150 BC. Marcus Porcius Cato, a Roman orator and the great-grandfather of Julius Caesar's famous enemy, walks the halls of the Roman Senate, but he is oblivious to his surroundings. For him, there is only one thing on his mind: Carthage.
Cato was only too well aware of the strategic position of Carthage. He could see that as long as Carthage was an independent stronghold, it was too close to Sicily and Italy to be allowed to harass shipping or maintain a military presence. He wanted it completely wiped out.
Now, with Carthage's one-time ally and neighbor, Numidia, starts to encroach on southern Carthaginian territory. Carthage feels obliged, and rightfully so, to defend itself, but there's a caveat. Since the Second Punic War, Carthage has promised Rome never to take up arms against anyone whatsoever without the consent of Rome. Rome sends a commission down to arbitrate this beef between Numidia and Carthage, and one of the deputies on that commission is Cato. And when Cato sees the prosperity with which Carthage has bounded back since the Second Punic War, he goes right back to Rome. He rails against the Senate that this prosperity means one thing and one thing only: Carthage is going to be at our doorstep with arms in no time. No matter what speech he makes, roads, politics, taxes, he always ends with ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delenda, which means, furthermore, I say Carthage should be destroyed. Now, Carthage, feeling it's going to be annihilated, no help from Rome, takes up arms. Rome sends an army down to Carthage. Rome tells Carthage, you have to abandon and evacuate your city. Carthage refuses. Thus starts the Third Punic War. But now Rome has got a problem, because the strongest fortifications in all of antiquity at that time are the walls of Carthage.
Today, time has reduced the fortress to its foundations, but in 149 BC, these protective walls were the city's last hope.
It was a three-part wall system with massive stone circuit wall. It covered a huge extent and was thought to be unbeatable.
A wonder of the world, those Carthaginian walls, and the Carthaginians trusted them.
The wall had a circumference of 23 miles and a series of 3 protective layers. First, a ditch backed by a low wall packed with excavated soil, which would have been manned by a front line of soldiers who could withdraw quickly in the face of a major assault. The second wall was constructed of stone and dominated the outer defenses. Behind this second wall stood an even more impenetrable third wall, 45 feet in height and at least 30 feet wide. 15 towers were spaced at 200-yard intervals where watchmen stood guard.
Inside this wall lived part of the Carthaginian army, including 20,000 men, 300 elephants, who prepared for any type of attack that took place.
The wall system surrounding Carthage made it the best fortified city in all of the Mediterranean, if not the world. And against the Romans, it would face its ultimate test, led by the fabled Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal.
The Carthaginian commander who would lead the Carthaginians during the Third Punic War was Hasdrubal. He is the one responsible for retaliating against the Numidians, and he is the guy who's going to be leading the main resistance.
As the Roman legions descended on the city, the Carthaginians hurriedly scrambled to build a new defensive force.
The women gave their hair up. They cut their hair so that they could make rope to fire the catapults. They emptied the prisons. The old men volunteered. People who hadn't been blacksmiths for 20 years said, "I'll try again," and they rearmed themselves in an explosion of intent and determination that we really have to go to the siege by the Germans of Stalingrad to see again.
In 2 months of frenzied work, they produced 6,000 shields, 18,000 swords, 30,000 spears, 120 ships, and 60,000 catapult missiles. Despite the arsenal Carthage had assembled, Rome had sent an overwhelming force. The city was alone, facing its own destruction.
There was no area left alone without Rome or Roman allies, with none of the colonies in a position to stand up to Rome. Carthage was left on her own.
The city hunkered down behind its immense fortifications, hoping against all odds that their walls would repel the impending Roman invasion.
Carthage held off the Roman attack for 3 years. And even in the last days after the Romans broke through the walls, it took 7 days before they could get to the top of the citadel, of moving through town like a juggernaut.
The Roman siege squeezed the life out of the city from the outside. And eventually, although the immense land wall was never breached, the Romans managed to scale those at sea. Inside the city, the fighting continued street by street. Few Carthaginian snipers were left, but they were so fierce that the Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus ordered the city to be set on fire and leveled. Thousands of Carthaginians were burned alive in the blaze.
It was a firestorm. It must have been hellish for the residents, people fleeing.
During its siege and capture, Carthage had been decimated. The city's population fell from 500,000 to 50,000. The survivors were sold as slaves, never to return home.
It took just 17 days in the year 146 BC for Carthage to be completely destroyed by fire. That same year, Rome leveled Corinth, put Greece in their pocket, and overnight, the Mediterranean Sea became their own private lake. Carthage would rise again, albeit this time reconstructed by Rome, like this fantastic amphitheater here at El Jim. And by the 3rd century